Welcome to the Emancipate Your Mind podcast. I'm your host, certified religious transition and trauma recovery coach, Terry Hales. I help people step out of the shadows of religious fear and shame and embrace their authentic selves with love and empathy. If you're ready to throw off the shackles of learned binary thinking and explore a more nuanced approach to life, this is your playground. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Emancipate Your Mind podcast. This week, I have my husband and licensed professional counselor, Kevin Hales, on the podcast with me. We're going to be talking about a question that has actually come up over the past several weeks as we've been talking about narcissistic personality disorder, the several different kinds of narcissism that we often see in high demand religion. And we've been talking about codependency with some of this as well. And there are a couple of you that have reached out and said, I've tried not to be codependent. I'm trying to heal that part of myself, but I'm feeling really lonely and I feel really disconnected. And sometimes when that happens, it's because we've gone from one far end of the spectrum, which is codependency, to the other far end of the spectrum, which is like extreme independence. And we're going to talk about that whole spectrum and where we're trying to land in the middle, which is interdependence. So I brought in Kevin because Kevin talks about interdependence a lot in his work with couples. He deals with relationships on a daily basis in his work, in his office. And I wanted his perspective on this. So welcome to the podcast again, Kevin.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. It's really nice because you live here, so
I know.
It makes interviewing you very easy. We're just going to have a discussion today. We're going to talk about these different ideas. And the main thing that I want you all to get from this is an understanding of what interdependence is and how you can begin to work towards this in your relationships, whether it's a long-established relationship or whether you're creating brand new relationships. So to get started, let's go ahead and just kind of talk about the difference between codependence, extreme independence, and like what interdependence actually is.
So before we actually talk about that, I think what I'll explain is where my approach to this comes from. Leaving a cult, you are trained and brainwashed to believe that everything is black and white. And in Mormonism, there's a hymn that we sing called Choose the Right, and there's this idea that there's a right and a wrong decision in everything that we do. And I always need to be choosing the right, even to the extent where I don't know how many Mormons do it anymore, but you as a small child in primary, you would receive this little ring that had the letters CTR on it, choose the right. And I even went so far as to wear 2 CTR rings for, 10, 15 years of my life. I don't even remember how many years I wore those, but I got one on my mission in Brazil, and it was conserva tua rota, which is CTR in Portuguese. So I wore a Portuguese and an English one for many, many years. But anyways, the point is, there's this idea that, so many things in life are black and white, or that they should be. And leaving that mindset caused me to look at things, and pretty much I would say everything nowadays, on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Not everything. In fact, I would say there's very few things that can be put in a very binary, right or wrong, yes or no way. Just about everything can be looked at on a spectrum. And why that's important is because when we understand human behavior, what we see is this tendency to gravitate towards extremes. Now, I try not to use the words always, never, a whole lot, but I feel pretty comfortable saying it's always dangerous to go to extremes, whatever that may be. It's healthy to drink water, but if we drink too much water, we'll kill ourselves. If, it's healthy to exercise, but you can over exercise. It's good to eat, but you can overeat or undereat, or, whatever topic or idea, it can be put on a spectrum, and 99% of the time it's going to be dangerous to go to one of those extremes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of where this comes from for me, right? Is I've tried to look at so many different things on a spectrum, and that word codependent, right, is pretty much a bad word in most people's minds.
Especially right now, I feel like in society right now, codependency is like everywhere. And yeah, it's
seen as this negative, bad thing. But guess what? For any of us who come from a very religious upbringing, guess what also is a bad word in our mind? It's also the word selfish, mm-hmm. right? And that's unfortunate, because that's something you hear a lot, not just in religion, but outside of religion, that the pinnacle, the ideal, is that we should not be selfish. We should be what? Selfless. And so there we are on another spectrum.
Which literally means not having a self.
Exactly.
And thinking about it. Yeah.
Right. It's really, it should be uncomfortable and disturbing if you think about that on the extreme. But that's what most of us have been raised to believe and idolize, mm-hmm. is this idea of not having a self, of only living for others and only serving others, and not caring for yourself, not, ultimately taking care of yourself, not being selfish. Guess what? It's okay to be selfish. Now, on that extreme of selfishness, 99% of the population are going to agree, oh, that's not good. That's bad. That's healthy. But how many people are going to agree that being on the extreme end of selflessness is not healthy? Very few.
Yeah. So that's a whole continuum, a whole spectrum, with selfishness at one end and selflessness mm-hmm. at the other end. Mm-hmm. And being too far on either extreme it can be dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think where a lot of that originates is in our brain, as I know you've talked about a lot in your podcast, is we have that lizard reptilian part of the brain, and its main concern is safety. Its main concern is protection. And, the main responses we experience in that part of the brain is fight or flight. And if you think about it, those are two extremes of one continuum as well. On the one end, you've got fight, and on the other end, you've got flight. And guess what? There can be a happy medium. And so that's what I'm always looking for. What is the happy medium here? And that's hard, because number one, a happy medium is usually going to be different for everyone. Mm-hmm. There is no, universal rule or law about how selfish or selfless I should be. There's no universal law about how, codependent or independent I should be. And that's going to be different for all of us individually and relationally. And so that's obviously what we're going to be talking about here, is that spectrum, that continuum of, on the far extreme, we've got codependence. And on the other extreme, we've got
extreme independence.
Extreme independence is really the best way to describe it, because when we just say independence, again, that's something most people, and I would say most people from a Western society can relate to. There's a lot of Eastern cultures and Arabic cultures and other parts of the world that don't value independence as much as we do in a lot of Western cultures. And so America and a lot of Europe and so forth, that idea of being independent is greatly valued and encouraged, right? And so you see a lot of parental practice and a lot of just in the culture of encouraging people to be independent. But taken to an extreme, it can be dangerous. Not good, not healthy. And that's what I think you see a lot of people doing, particularly in Western cultures, because that is encouraged. Yeah. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, those other cultures that don't encourage independence, we could probably argue they rely a little too much on the codependent side of things. A lot of people don't have an identity. They don't, know who they are as a person because it's so tied up in the family and bringing honor to the family and not embarrassing the family. And I think, again, a lot of that probably has its roots in tribalism and how once upon a time that was the only way to survive, was to stick together, stick with your tribe, stick with your family. But again, a lot of those harken back to the very stark binary black and white fight or flight, responses that we feel in our brains. And if we're following Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once those basic needs in our life are met, we consistently have food and shelter and
we're safe.
And we're safe. If those are being met, then that allows us to move up the pyramid. It allows us to focus and think about other things.
So basically what you're saying is because we have become very good at getting our needs met for the most part, because there are still people who are food insecure, who are shelter insecure, right? But as a society, for the most part, we have enough food, we have enough shelter, we are generally safer. We're not being eaten by predators on a daily basis, or hunted down by predators on a daily basis. And so because of that, we've been able to start the process of like working through like being loved and belonging and on up that pyramid towards self-actualization.
Right. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's wonderful. It's good news to celebrate and applaud that we, generally speaking, not everyone, of course, but generally speaking, most of us have those basic needs met. And therefore, it's a double-edged sword because it allows us to focus on other things, but that can also be hard and uncomfortable because sometimes I think we are stuck in just having those basic needs met. So I can't tell you how many times I see in my room where the man who's the traditional provider has been raised to believe that is the man's primary job, is to provide. Yeah. And so when that man is providing a house and food and those basic things, they're genuinely shocked and surprised when their spouse says, "Hey, I don't feel emotionally connected to you." And they say, "What the hell are you talking about?" It's like, I don't even know what you mean.
I'm providing for your needs. I'm doing my part.
Right.
Like, you have food.
Right.
You have shelter. Look at this nice house.
Right.
Yeah.
And you'll hear a lot of comments along those lines of basically it comes across, of course, as emotionally dismissive and minimizing towards, what that person is trying to, tell their spouse. But in their mind, they feel like they're doing their job.
They're meeting needs.
Right. I'm providing you these things. What do you have to complain about? And then that's where comparative suffering comes in, because then people are looking outside themselves and they see other people who have less than them. And so it's easy to go, well, I shouldn't be complaining, or I shouldn't be whining about this, or I shouldn't want this, or I shouldn't need this. But this is a very natural part of evolving as humans, is that as we have those basic needs met, it allows us to focus and think about and worry about the deeper
needs. Connections. Right. Yeah. Once we know that we're safe, we have enough to eat, we have shelter over our heads, like our needs are met, our survival needs are met.
Right.
Then we move into that mammalian part of our brain where we have connection needs.
Yeah.
And then up into the higher brain, once those are met, into self-actualization and the ability to like understand ourselves better.
Right. Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep. Yeah, basically. In fact, it's funny because as you know, I like to watch lots of movies, and there's a common plot theme that you see in a lot of movies where a husband and a wife, or they start off in the movie divorced or
on the brink of
divorce, and their relationship obviously isn't doing well. And throughout the course of the movie, there's some catastrophic, tragic thing that happens. Maybe it's an end of the world apocalyptic film, and suddenly they come together, as a couple and as a family again to survive. Or there's another one where they were in some foreign town, somewhere, across the world. And I think the town like broke into civil war or something violent, uprising or something like that.
And they needed to like do that tribal thing to survive, or like have each other's back.
But therein lies the problem, right? Because the movie always ends on that happy note of, oh, they came back together and they're a happy couple again. But I guarantee you, once they have gotten back into that safe, calm environment again, where their basic needs are being met, those same relational problems are going to pop up again, and they're not going to be a good match unless they can work through that again together. And so it's just interesting. I've been noticing that a lot. I'm like, wait a second, this is that common theme where they always come together, and it makes sense because most couples, nowadays, most couples when they divorce, they're not divorcing because my spouse doesn't provide for me. They're divorcing because I'm not emotionally connected to you, and you don't empathize with me, and you don't hear me, and you're not understanding. It's these higher level needs that aren't being met.
Yeah.
And that's why they're getting divorced, not because you beat me and
don't provide, and we're starving.
Right.
And yeah.
Not to say that obviously doesn't happen still. That's the unfortunate reality, is that there's always going to be those exceptions. There's always going to be those situations where, that abuse is happening. And so I don't feel safe, or you give me this, tiny allowance and I can barely buy enough groceries to feed ourselves and the kids. But
so what I'm hearing you say is like, we crave connection because our basic needs are met.
Right.
And I'm almost hearing like a spectrum here, like we talked about at the beginning, of there is a part of us that is dependent on one another. We're wired to connect, as they say, right? We're wired to connect because that has been part of our survival mechanism. And it's a need for us. Like even up on that hierarchy of needs, there's tribalism at the bottom because that helps us like eat and protect ourselves. But then up above that is the love and belonging piece, and that emotional security that also comes from being connected to other people.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's an independence piece as well, of being an individual in a tribe. And once those basic food, shelter, safety needs are met, it's like our nervous system calms down to the point where we can like begin to look at, who am I? Those more existential questions. Who am I? What do I value? What do I believe? What's the meaning of my life?
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking for a balance between those two. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, yeah, you'll hear that phrase, we're wired to connect. And that's, I think that's probably true on a basic level. But again, we can put that on a spectrum and say, well, how much do we desire that need to connect with other people? And of course, you're going to get people all over that spectrum. You're going to get some people who are really needy and they want, to constantly be by your side and, and so forth. And then you're going to have other people who are very standoffish and, don't really desire much human connection at all. And of course, the big question is, well, why? Why does that happen? A lot of that, I'm sure we can chalk up to trauma and painful events that we've gone through in our life. One of my new couples that I'm meeting with right now, in our very first session, she before we even really jump into much of anything, she says, people are stupid, and I'm like, okay, interesting. Tell me why you think people are stupid, and give her a chance to voice that and tell me why she thinks people are stupid. Because to just make a statement like that says a lot, and of course, as we've met and gotten into more of the details, there's been incident after incident after incident of people who have betrayed her or let her down or hurt her and so on and so forth. Now, some of that, of course, is on the people who have done that to her. They obviously have a part to play in that, but some of that, of course, is just her. And I would argue she's probably had way too high of expectations about people and their ability to show up and be kind and nice and respectful.
Or maybe a lack of boundaries that have allowed people.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that we have, like we create kind of the same patterns that we grew up with sometimes because they feel safe, even in their unsafety, if that makes sense. They feel familiar, I guess I should say.
Right. Probably. I mean, that's what she would have to be honest and introspective with herself about. I can't tell her what all those things are because only she knows what's going on inside her head. So, yeah, that's going back to the spectrum, this continuum of, dependency, I guess we would call it. On one extreme, you've got codependency and that extreme independence on the other end. And we can argue that neither of those is very healthy. And so the ideal, that happy medium, is that what we would call interdependence. And that's basically what we're here to talk about, right?
Yeah. So we're looking for a balance between having an individual identity and a balance between being connected. And like you said, it's going to be different for every person and for every relationship. And so, in our relationship, what we're doing is, like, I like how you talk to your couples about interdependence being two individual people creating like a third entity together. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because I feel like that was really helpful in helping me understand interdependence.
Yeah. Basically, the way I like to think of it is each of us can and should be an individual. Each of us can and should be content and happy and fulfilled and generally healthy by ourselves as human beings. And the reason I say that is because I heard someone put it this way one time. They said, in a healthy, happy relationship, 1 + 1 = 3. And basically what that means is, because you'll hear studies, you'll hear research that says people live longer when they're married. They're happier when they're married, and so on and so forth. And so there's this idea that, marriage is the answer. And you have to be married in order to be happy, in order to live longer. Not true. This isn't about marriage. This is about being in a healthy relationship with yourself and then with other people. And that could be marriage, but it could also just be a long-term relationship with someone, or
long-term friendship,
or a long-term friendship, or if you're more towards the extreme end of independence, and you just don't want to be in a relationship. I'm sure there's evidence to show that you'll live just as long as someone who's in a happy marriage. But the reason,
if you have a good relationship with yourself.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to take the focus off of marriage, because there are plenty of unhealthy marriages out there. There are plenty of marriages where people are together for a really long time, but they're really not happy. They're really not close and connected to each other.
Yeah. They're like roommates.
Right. And so we have to, take the focus off of, marriage somehow being the magic answer. It's about that healthy mental, relationship you have with yourself and others. It always makes me laugh now as a therapist, because every now and then you'll see, like, I don't know, a television special or a documentary or something about couples who've been together 40, 50, 60 years. And of course, the question, universally that they almost ask all these couples is like, yeah, what's the secret? You figured it out. How did you do it? How did you last this long? And it's funny, because if you're really looking closely, and in fact, sometimes you can notice this, right? Go to a Denny's or some restaurant and watch the old couples who come in and sit with each other and eat there. You're going to see some who genuinely love each other. You'll see the sparkle in their eyes, and
they're laughing at each other.
They're laughing. They'll tease each other, right? And you just you see them. You can almost feel the love and the connection that they have with each other. And then you'll see the other, old couples who come in. There isn't a word exchange between them. Maybe they say something about the weather, or, oh, hey, look, there's something new on the menu, Marge, but it's just, they just eat in silence.
Yeah.
Right. And they just kind of go through the motions. They wipe their face, they get up, and they walk out the door and go on about their lives. And so a lot of focus is often put on time, and because you've been married this many decades, that you somehow have figured it out. And that's just not the case. Most couples, or I shouldn't say most, but there are lots of couples who have been married a really long time and they're not necessarily close and connected to each other. And so there's a lot happening there that we have to be real about and try to figure out, okay, what's going on, and is this ultimately what we want or what I want, or and figure that out.
Yeah. It makes me think of the Robin Williams quote where he says there's no, like, I'm going to butcher this, but there's no loneliness quite so lonely as being with people and feeling lonely. Like, whenever you're with people and you feel lonely, like that's even lonelier than being by yourself.
Right. Yeah. Something along those lines.
I totally butchered that.
But I'll look it up later, but it's that's a great example of how loneliness is not just, the idea that if I'm around people, I shouldn't feel lonely. Loneliness is not feeling connected, not feeling understood, not feeling heard by other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I was listening to Glennon Doyle's podcast yesterday, the We Can Do Hard Things, this latest episode. They were talking about kids and connection with kids and their parents. And one of the things they said is when a child is allowed to be fully themselves and that's encouraged, a child learns, I'm real. And I think that happens in adult relationships too, that when we feel seen and heard and really connected to another person, we both have the connection and the ability to be an individual. There's something about that like makes being alive real. Like it makes us a real person.
Yeah. Yeah. And and here's the quote by Robin Williams. I used to think the worst thing in life was to end up alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people that make you feel all alone.
Oh, yeah. He says it way better than I did.
but I mean, you conveyed the basic idea, which is loneliness is not just whether or not I have people around me.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned this idea that we have to have a good relationship with ourselves first in order to have a healthy relationship with another person. And I love that idea because I think that's a piece that we often miss. I think sometimes we come into relationships doing the Jerry Maguire thing, the you complete me crap. And so many of the romance movies that we watch have a codependent element to them of, I don't know fully who I am, but now that I'm in relationship with you, you complete me. I know myself better now, but I think we set ourselves up for codependency when we do that. And then we get hurt and then we have a tendency to slingshot to extreme independence.
Right.
Because we've been burned so many times in that codependent space. So can you help us understand why having a healthy relationship with ourselves is so important for creating healthy interdependent relationships?
Yeah, well, and I think you've already touched on it there. I think you did a good job explaining that because there is this idea that we are incomplete, right? If I tell you complete me, then what I'm also saying is I am incomplete without you. And we'll sometimes say that to people. You and I used to say that. We used to say, I need you in my life, or I would be completely and utterly lost without you, or I would be nothing without you. There's these ideas, these phrases that seem to convey that I'm less of a person. I'm not a whole person. I'm unable to be happy or content or any number of things without you, or without a partner, or without someone, like that in my life. And so that leads to codependency, right? Because then we become desperate. In fact, I being Mormon, in the past, and if you go to BYU and maybe this is true of a lot of colleges, but especially in Mormonism, you're encouraged to marry young, and you're encouraged to find that soulmate. And you probably don't hear this as much in Mormon culture, but once upon a time, you were actually considered like a menace to society, or like, what was the terminology? I can't remember.
Yeah, if you're like 20, 25 and unmarried, you're a menace to society. It was the Brigham Young quote.
Yeah, there's something along those lines. Basically, that if you and a lot of women in Mormonism would often feel like an old maid if they were 25 or older and unmarried, right? And in fact, I would imagine a lot of men maybe weren't even interested in them, right? Because then they're probably making the assumption there's something wrong with them or they're not marriage material or
I
something.
heard that a lot at BYU,
Yeah.
actually, both from women I was rooming with, the fear of being unmarried. I think the age had moved up to like 27 at
Sure.
the time I was at BYU, because, Brigham Young was a long time ago. But
Right.
there were women who were genuinely terrified about nearing 30 and being unmarried.
Or graduating and not being
Yes,
married.
or graduating and not being married, because there was this idea that I'm not a whole person, like I'm not fully an adult even. I'm not worthy if I'm
Right.
not married. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And especially for women, right? Because you're brainwashed from the very beginning to be a mom, and you can't be a mom unless you're married because you're not allowed to have sex, outside of marriage. And so there's this desperatism that comes to getting married and having a kid so that you are therefore worthy as a human being. And I remember this Mormon couple I met with, several years ago, and they were still just dating, but she was, oh, I can't remember. She was 40 or maybe 38 or 39. She'd never been married. And, the guy she was dating, I think his wife had died, so she was going to be his plural wife,
In the eternities.
in the temple. But
Yeah.
there was like this, they'd only been married or dating, I don't know, a couple months at this point. And you could just feel the desperateness, coming out of her because that biological clock is ticking. She's never been married. She's desperate to want to, have kids and get married, but they're also experiencing, several difficulties of, with the relationship and trying to get along. And of course, when you've been single for several decades, then making that transition into married life is a really difficult one. And that's, maybe leaning more towards the independent side of the spectrum. But yeah, so I guess bringing it back to what, you're talking about it's important to have this healthy individual relationship with yourself for a number of reasons. Number one, you are less likely to lean into that codependent realm where I think someone else has to fulfill me and make me happy and all those things.
And tell me who I am.
Right. And tell me who I am, because that's part of when you're on that extreme end of codependence, you have no identity.
Yeah.
Your identity is wrapped up in the other person and the idea of us. But it's that's where there's a lot of jealousy and accusations of people cheating because you're in this codependent realm, and because you're at work 8 hours a day, I don't know who you're talking to, and is your coworker cute, and you're clawing at details that really are probably irrelevant and definitely don't really matter, because you're so desperate to hang on to.
You're so worried about losing your person that defines who you are.
Right.
Well, and I find even if there isn't jealousy, there's the clinginess. Clinginess is the word that's coming to mind for me. Like people that need to check in multiple times throughout the day and like need that constant security that you're still there. Yeah. You're still there. You're still there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
if you have that healthy relationship with yourself, then you're obviously not so desperate, for someone else to fulfill that in you. And then of course that leads to later marital issues and problems, because then that's probably a constant source of conflict and fighting, that, hey, you're not doing your part. You're not making me happy. You're not showing me how you love me and all these other things. Not that those aren't obviously important. We still want to be complimented. We still want to be, validated and heard, but we aren't reliant on that.
Yeah.
For our well-being.
Yeah. Well, and I'm even thinking about earlier in our marriage. I've already told the listeners that we had some codependence happening earlier in our marriage. And I remember, like, particularly when I was in that place where I was getting diagnosed with clinical depression, the codependency, like from my side was, you were deployed all the time and like needing that constant reassurance. And that wasn't there so much. You weren't there to build me up. And I was kind of left to my own devices. But correct me if I'm wrong, there was a part of you that almost felt like a failure because I had gotten into that dark, clinically depressed place. There was a part of you that felt like you somehow weren't doing your job well enough.
Of course. Yeah, because that's something we're led to believe, right? Again, as a provider, that I need to make you happy, right?
Yeah.
You know, that if you're not happy, and that's one of the reasons we're sometimes uncomfortable with our spouse's emotions, is that we almost immediately assume this is somehow my fault,
Yeah.
or I'm somehow not following through in my responsibility as your husband or your wife or partner or whatever. And so it's hard not to take it personally that, oh, you're sad. Well, shit, what did I do? You know, how did I drop the ball? You know, oh, you're angry. Well, what did I do? You know, and you're scared. Well, what are you scared of? you know, it's in fact, that's, you know, one of my earliest, you know, big emotional conversations I remember between the two of us is you revealed to me one of your deepest fears, which was you were afraid I was going to wake up one day and realize what I had married and run away screaming. And instead of giving you that empathetic, compassionate response that you needed, you were vulnerable. You just shared your heart with me. And instead, I made it about me, right? Because then I'm like, well, what? I haven't shown you at this point that I'm staying. You know, I haven't proven to you that I'm going to be loyal or that I'm not leaving you or I'm not going to run away. You know,
You make yourself sound like such an asshole.
I was. I'm
nicer than that, though.
But I mean, but it's in essence, that's basically what I was saying or feeling. You know, it's like I was taking it personally because that was my responsibility to make you happy, right? You know, one of the leaders of the Mormon church back then, you know, said in one of his conference talks, he said that God will count the tears that your wife sheds. And so think about the responsibility that puts on the guy, you know, to make my wife happy, to keep her, you know, from ever crying or getting sad or all these other things. And man, it is so unhealthy on so many levels, you know. And I guess that's one of the biggest failings of any religion, in my opinion, is that they don't allow you to be human.
Yeah.
They have this unrealistic, perfect standard that you're supposed to strive for. You're not supposed to feel certain emotions. But guess what? That's part of being human.
Yeah.
And if we're going to have that healthy relationship with ourselves and then be able to have a healthy relationship with another human being, we need to give ourselves some grace. We have to give other people that same grace and compassion. And we have to stop leaning on religion for advice about how to be a healthy human being. It's like leaning on religion for medical advice or dietary, you know, stuff. And again, right, nowadays, you know, a lot of religions like to boast that, you know, like the Mormonism has always boasted about their word of wisdom and how revolutionary that was. Actually, it really wasn't that amazing and that far ahead of its time. It was actually reflecting a lot of similar movements during that time. But in the long, you know, run, you know, it's funny because a lot of people now, when they look back on the word of wisdom in Mormon history, they're like, well, geez, why didn't God tell us to wash our hands more? Why didn't God tell us to boil our water? You know, those would have been far more helpful and healthy, you know, in the long run than avoiding quote unquote hot drinks. What does that even mean? You know, and so on and so forth. And so,
by the way, really quick, there was a whole episode on Mormon discussions. If you want to hear more about the word of wisdom and how it really came about, that just happened a few weeks ago. Fascinating stuff. It was kind of like a turf war between the women of the church and the men of the church, particularly Emma Smith and the men of the church. And the hot drinks came about as kind of the men getting back at the women for not wanting them to have tobacco. Super fun information over there. That's awesome. I love church history. There's so much going on. I'm so glad people do that work because not my favorite work, but I love hearing about it. So if you're interested in that, go over to Mormon Discussions, either on YouTube or on the podcast, and go look up that whole like hour, 2 hour discussion about how the word of wisdom actually came about. If you're LDS listening to this, ex-Mormon, and you want to know some of the history about that, fascinating stuff. But yeah, let's talk.
I'm trying to remember how we got on that subject.
I don't remember how we got on. Oh, we were talking about you and me. And
oh yeah, like, yeah. So I was like, oh yeah, because I felt responsible for how you were feeling, and the fact that you were scared that I wasn't going to be there for you or that I would figure out who you were. That felt offensive to me because I felt like I was failing.
Yeah.
I felt like I wasn't doing my job. That if I was a good husband, if I was doing my job, you shouldn't be feeling that. Because to feel fear is bad. To feel, it says it throughout all scriptures that have ever been written, fear not, and there's this idea that if you feel fear, you're weak, you're less of a person.
You're not doing it right.
And don't feel angry. Plenty of religious leaders throughout time have always preached against anger and what was it, Monson, that said school your emotions, right? So there's this idea that you're not supposed to feel certain things, and then of course in a relationship sense, then I'm going to feel responsible or I'm going to feel at fault that you're feeling this. And so again, allow ourselves to be human, to feel all of the things, because that's part of what it means to be human, and allow ourselves to learn from that. I'm always telling people that emotions are like messengers. They're just trying to let us know, hey, you're feeling something, and what's causing this, what's playing into this, why are you feeling this, so that we can better understand it. And then when we're talking about an interdependent relationship, a healthy relationship, ideally we need to be able to share those emotions with each other, and because we've done our individual work and I'm in a more emotionally mature place, I'm not threatened by that, or at least not as much, right? Because I think we're always going to feel that to a certain extent of like, well, crap, did I do this, or did I somehow make you feel like I you can't trust me, or that I've hurt you, so that's healthy to an extent, right? Because it shows that we're trying to take responsibility and ownership for my part in this. But that's the balance we're striving for, and that's part of what we're talking about here, right? Because what it boils down to in the end is there's my work, there's your work, and then there's our work.
I like that. Help us break down that really quickly. How do you tell what's your work, what's the other person's work, and what is the collective work?
It's a good question, and I don't think there's always going to be a clear answer. In a nutshell, I think the question we should always ask ourselves is, how much of this problem or issue that I'm looking at, how much of this is within my control to change?
And then that's my work.
And well, it depends what the answer to that question is.
Okay.
So how much of this is within my control to change or to affect? And if the answer is 0 or next to none, then yeah, that's probably, that's maybe someone else's work to do. Or if it's mostly within my control to change or to do something about, then that's probably my work. And then of course, our work is not so much specific issues, but how we interact with one another. So our work is almost always going to exist on a interactional level. And so, as we've talked about in some of our other episodes with, conflict resolution, one of us might take on more of a withdrawer role when it comes to conflict, and the other person might take on more of a pursuing role. And those align with the fight or flight responses that we feel in our head. And so the fighter is going to be more of the pursuer, and the withdrawer is going to be more of the fleer. And neither of those is more right or wrong than the other. But that's important to understand, because then we have to understand how that plays out between us. And so if I know I'm more the withdrawer and you're the pursuer, then the us work that we need to focus on is trying to be sensitive to that and meet in the middle as much as possible, and know that you're more of that pursuer. So I need to be sensitive to what you need, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings us back to the idea of two individuals creating that third entity, that 1 + 1 = 3, which is I learn to listen to my emotions and label them and be able to understand what messages they're giving me. Like I develop emotional intelligence, the ability to sit with my emotions, process them, and learn how to communicate them. And together, both of us do that work for ourselves. And we come to one another to communicate, to actively listen, to create a space of curiosity and non-judgment, a place where we're accountable for our part. When someone is telling us how maybe our actions or words have affected them, like we can be accountable and also expect the other person to be accountable. And like we create this sense of, you're safe here. Like I'm not going to share this or triangulate with somebody outside of this relationship. This is our work to do together. But we do that from doing our own work and then being able to collaborate together to find a win-win. And I think that's really what's important here is, interdependence is going to look different for all of us depending on what feels like a win-win for both of us, because there are couples that are withdrawer and couples that are pursuer. And so what we need from each other is going to be different.
Right.
We're getting into so many good things, but I'm going to stop the discussion right there for this week because Kevin and I actually talked for another further 45 minutes about interdependence and about how we can begin to create that healthy dynamic in our relationships. And I don't want to overwhelm you with information. So I thought this was a good place to stop. We've talked about what interdependence is. We've talked about how having a healthy relationship with ourselves helps us begin to build those healthy relationships with others. And there's lots to digest in this 45-minute segment. So thank you so much for joining us. What I want you to do is I would love for our small step forward this week to be if you will take some time and think about a specific relationship in your life and ask yourself, what is my work? What is your part of that relationship? What are the things that you can be accountable for and responsible for in the relationship? What parts are within your control? What is their work? What are the things that are outside of your control that only they can work on with regards to your relationship? And then what is our work? What is the work that both of you have to bring to the table in order for this to be a healthy, interdependent relationship? You can examine a relationship that's already healthy if you want, or you can look at one that's problematic in your life and help you kind of sort through what is mine, what is theirs, and what is ours. And write those things down where you can concretely see them, continue to think about them, and it will help you get a clearer idea of where the work needs to be done in the relationship and what you can do to bring some more equilibrium into your relationship. Also, don't forget, MORMONPALOOZA is coming up here in just a couple of weeks on October 1st. It's going to be in Salt Lake City. For those of you who are ex-Mormon, who are living in Utah, it's going to be so much fun. It's like a really irreverent spin off of a stake youth conference. So I'm going to be part of the fireside portion of the evening. I'm doing a 50-minute hands-on training about inner child work as a way to heal religious trauma, to get to know yourself and to begin to have that compassion and kindness for yourself, to begin to feel the things your inner wisdom is trying to tell you so you can begin to really connect with that compass inside of you that will help you navigate faith transition, not only when you first leave the church, but years afterwards. So I would love to see you there. We're also going to be hearing from Sarah Urquhart from Mormons on Mushrooms. She's actually the creator of MORMONPALOOZA. So thank you, Sarah, for inviting me. This is so fantastic. And Lindsay Hansen Park, for those of you who have listened to the Year of Polygamy podcast, you know how incredible she is. Lindsay Hansen Park was also one of the main collaborators and historians used for Under the Banner of Heaven, the TV series with Andrew Garfield. And if you haven't watched that, it's so fantastic. So it's going to be so fun. The fireside portion goes for a couple of hours. There's plenty of speakers that you'll get a chance to hear from and workshops that you'll get to go to. And then there's a road show. So lots of ex-Mormon comedians and musicians and just lots of great entertainment. And then there will be a stake dance afterwards that is disco themed. And Kevin and I will be there. We'd love to see you. We'd love to talk with you. Don't hesitate to come up to us and say, hey, like, I know you from the podcast. I'd love to talk with you. I know sometimes it gets a little weird when you've just been listening to someone's voice and you worry that maybe they don't want to talk to you. That's not the case here. If you're coming, get your ticket. Make sure that you come and say hello to Kevin and I at this event. We can't wait to see you. Thanks so much for spending your time with me today. And I look forward to seeing you as we continue this discussion next week.